of all of them. Now let's go on to the next one, which is voluntary employment, an important cornerstone of anarcho-capitalist theory.
Yeah, so we're just not going to actually receive any sort of like a treatment of what the NEP actually is. He's just moving on. He's just moving on. I thought maybe he was just very idiosyncratic with his editing style, and after he'd explained all that, he was going to say, and here's what the NEP is, but it's looking less and less likely as time goes on.
Is voluntarism, which is the proposition that the only just actions or relationships are between mutually consenting parties.
If only there was some sort of a principle that would make it very clear and precise what we mean by that, and where consent is required, where it isn't required, so on and so forth. Some sort of a principle. Maybe it would be against aggression, like, you know, the do not aggress principle, something like that. The DNAP, the do not aggress principle. If only we had such a principle, and if only we knew about it in this video, then we would be able to evaluate these things.
In other words, the use of unilateral force, which is not justified prior by consensual agreement on terms, or the application of force to compel non-consenting parties to perform or abstain from actions, is immoral. Voluntarism originates in the work of Auberon Herbert, whose philosophy differs in some details from anarcho-capitalism, insofar as he proposes the creation of a voluntarily funded state to keep order and enforce contracts. But nonetheless, the basic moral principles of voluntarism are part of the basis for anarcho-capitalist moral arguments.
No, not the basis. The basis of anarcho-capitalist arguments are not voluntarism. That's entirely false. The basis of anarcho-capitalist arguments are the non-aggression principle. What is the non-aggression principle, Natty Bud Light? You told us in this video before? I don't think so. Oh yes, when you don't step on the snake. Yes, this libertarianism, it sounds ludicrous. That's not a proper principle.
Libertarians claim that employment contracts are, under free market conditions, completely voluntary.
Yeah, it's just a tautology. That's just tautologically the case. Under free market conditions, i.e., where there are no triangular interventions or coercion or anything like that, then yeah, the only arrangements that could possibly obtain there are voluntary ones. That's the definition of the free market. So how is he going to debunk this tautology?
As such, the claim made by Marxists that employers exploit the labor power of employees to make profit by extracting surplus labor value is apparently refuted.
No, that's not the refutation of it. The refutation of it is the refutation of labor theory value. Because when they're saying exploitation, again, when a Marxist is truly with their Marxist hat on, and they say exploitation, all that means is the factual condition that surplus value is being extracted. It's not a moral claim at all. So the refutation from an Austrian perspective would involve refuting the labor theory of value upon which this is based. That's actually completely outside of anarcho-capitalist legal theory, completely outside of it.
The employee agreed to such and such a wage, and he agreed to perform such and such labor for a certain number of hours. Therefore, if he feels he is underpaid relative to his productive output, he is simply projecting an entitlement to which he never consented in the first place, and therefore he is not exploited. Marxists give the most obvious rebuttal to this argument, which is that the
Is this guy a Marxist? Like, are you going to agree with this argument?
circumstances which compel a person to seek employment are not consensual, such as the threat of starvation or...
So what? You starve. So what? What is the moral implication here? Right? According to Marxism, there could be no moral implication there. So why is this being brought up in a video disputing our legal theory? If there could not possibly be any moral implications behind work or starve within Marxism itself, why is this being brought up? Right? And fundamentally, that doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. That, yes, it is the case that if you don't produce, or somebody doesn't produce for you, that yeah, you will die. That's just a fact of reality. That's what scarcity means. Okay? Now the question is that given scarcity, how do you best allocate production? And the answer is the free market. And given scarcity, we can have conflicts. How do you best deal with conflicts? You avoid them. I wonder what ideology is claiming that.
Homelessness, and as such, employers are practicing an implicit form of coercion against employees who have no ability to determine the...
Howard Rourke says, and Alice shrugged, in response to this type of thing, okay, then go to the bush and pluck the job off that bush where you think it grows. This is the point at hand. Why is it possible for there to be that job in the first place? It didn't just exist in nature. It's not that the capitalist has cosseted this job away from you and hoarded up all the jobs. They make that job possible in the first place. So if you don't want to engage with them, you don't have to. You aren't owed their productive capacity. You're not owed slaves. This is a crazy take that we have, that I guess these guys don't have, is that we're in fact opposed to slavery. And this is, if only we knew about the bronze bull then we would know how slavery is actually okay sometimes. I guess that's the argument going on here.
Conditions under which they work. This argument is rather weak because in prosperous Western countries where food is in abundance, and in which there are, at least in socially democratic countries, vast and easily accessible welfare states, the possibility that an unemployed person with sound mental health would literally starve to death or die from exposure is scant.
You know how you actually stop starvation? Production. Production is how you stop starvation. Do you know how many times throughout history it was that hunger was wiped out? It happened only in the capitalist countries. The capitalist countries wiped out hunger. As it turns out, in the West, it wasn't charitable donations or welfare states. It wasn't that they started implementing those things, and then suddenly there was an abundance of food. No, they privatized the food. They privatized production of food, and then there was an abundance.
Even in the United States, depending on where you live, there are usually homeless shelters that offer free food and lodging. If you don't live in a city, there is nevertheless enough food available, such that it would be rather difficult to actually starve to death. Most people would probably buy a hamburger for someone if they were really in such a bad situation. And above all, the employer did not actually create these conditions, such as scarcity of resources, the physical needs of your body, and so forth. So it would be rather absurd to hold him responsible for coercing people. So we might grant that in the West, at least no one is going to starve to death if they can't get or refuse to get a job. That being said, the second part of the argument elucidates what is really problematic with voluntarism. The employee has no bargaining power. Every contract...
Not necessarily the case. Okay, you have leverage to some degree in every negotiation. If you are top AI talent and Google wants to acquire you from OpenAI, you actually have a whole lot of bargaining power. That's why they were paid so goddamn much. Right? You got all the bargaining power in the world. They want you more than you want them. The real question is, how do you get more people like that? Well, people need to be more productive. How do you get more productive? You have a more complex capital structure. One's labor is more productive accordingly. How do you get a more complex capital structure? Well, you have to allow people to produce such a structure. And how do you allow that to happen? They have to have freedom. They have to have property rights.
An employee enters with an employer is biased in favor of the employer, who gets to determine the terms and conditions of that employment, even to such an extent that the requirements of the job might outstrip the ability for the employee to meet, and frequently will fall below the employee's actual financial requirements in terms of wages and benefits. The ultimate problem with voluntarism, and this is where the obvious...
I was just doing a quick, for anybody who's just listening, I'm just doing a quick little boo-hoo sign into the camera, because who gives a shit? Hey, oh no, it's below what I want to happen. Well, okay, I want McDonald's to hire me tomorrow, and my wage will be 1 private jet per hour. Anything less than it's below my expectations, and so they're exploiting me. They're coercing me, because it's below my expectations. Therefore, NAP false. You know, who'll pay for the private jets? Doesn't matter. Doesn't matter. Am I productive enough to warrant that? Doesn't matter. Doesn't matter. Just throw that all to the side. Drop that context, okay? Just drop that context fully.
This argument fails to actually hit the right target is that the voluntariness of a relationship is not binary, but rather it lies on a spectrum depending on how much power, both in terms of economy and authority, one party leverages over the other. We can imagine two very different kinds of relationship to illustrate why consent alone is not enough to render a relationship completely voluntary. The first is a friendship. Friends are generally, if not always, equal in terms of their power vis-a-vis each other. A forced friendship is an absurdity and obviously not a friendship. If one person is using his fame or wealth to secure the affection of another person, we can hardly consider that a friendship. In the classical world, writers like Aristotle remarked that the fundamental basis of friendship is equality.
Does this guy just want to show off that he did like a quick, like, you know, History 101 course on like Coursera or some shit? Is that just what is that what this video is?
Equality and power. He said verbatim that friends have all things in common, something that would not be possible if friends differed in their leverage over one another. As such, the friendship is sort of an ideal type of relationship, completely equal in terms of power, and thus completely and unambiguously voluntary. You can enter into or leave a friendship at will without material fear of deprivation or coercion. And before anyone brings it up, yes, romantic relationships are kind of like friendships. If they aren't, that's usually kind of a problem.
Well, so I can be materially deprived, in a certain sense. I can have values deprived from me if I exit a friendship. Namely, I'll no longer have the whatever values are involved in that friendship. So it's just wrong, in fact.
And you should probably go to therapy. The second type of relationship is slavery. Under slavery, there is a massive power imbalance between the master and the slave, to such an extent.
There's not just a power imbalance. Okay? What is the fundamental aspect of slavery? It's one person possessing a different person. Okay? preventing that person from doing things, namely aggressively preventing them from doing things. That is the defining aspect, not just that there's a power imbalance. But guess what, Mr. Statist? As it turns out, there's a power imbalance between little old me and the head of government. You're good with that. You're good with that, though.
And that the slave possesses no influence over the master, and the master possesses complete influence over the slave. One may enter into a slave relationship, in which case it is called indentured servitude, but one cannot voluntarily leave it. As such, the slave, or the indentured servant, because he is not equal to his master, has no right nor power to determine the conditions of that relationship.
You know, this is complete hogwash as far as our theory is concerned. You cannot sell yourself into slavery. If you want to be an indentured servant, go ahead. But you're allowed to leave anytime you want. Maybe you no longer get to live in the Lord's castle or whatever. You no longer get... You can leave.
He can be compelled to work, he can be starved or punished, and he can be the victim of force applied in any way which is convenient to the master. Between slavery and friendship, there's a whole panoply of different kinds of relationship that we encounter in society, such as business partnerships in which the financial resources commanded or represented by either party function as a basis for bargaining, and in which the balance can tilt toward either end depending on that end's economic situation. The same is true, mutatis mutandis.
Just stop trying with the words, okay, buddy? Just cut it off. Just cut it off. So, okay, we get it. Okay, you think it's very impressive. You think it's very impressive, I'm sure. Well, just cut it off, okay? I'm trying to do you a favor here. Just cut it off.
A political relationship such as those between the leaders of different countries. But the most important type of relationship for us in this middle zone is the employment contract. Employees suffer a great degree of deprivation of power vis-a-vis the employer.
Both sides have to agree to terms with respect to each other in order for the contract to happen. Fundamentally, you agree to those fucking terms. Just because you're an employee doesn't in fact mean you get to walk into the CEO's office and take his keys and drive his Lamborghini out of there. No. Yeah, you're deprived of that power. You also didn't have that power in the first place, right? They selectively gave you some power to access employee-only areas and so on and so forth. And you're upset that they didn't give you full dominion over the entire company, I guess.
Lower end of the wage scale, there's no room for bargaining over wages whatsoever, since one is easily replaceable, and there is what Marx called...
Well, there is actually bargaining still. Just you don't have a whole lot of leverage if all you're doing is flipping burgers. Correct. Who cares? What is your solution to this, Mr. Monarchist? To force the most productive people, to hire the least productive people, because those people are the least productive. Sacrifice the most productive for the sake of the least productive, due to their lack of production. Hatred of the good for being the good. Envy. That's what you advocate for.
The reserve army of laborers ready and waiting to replace him if he proves to be a hard bargainer. On the higher end of the wage scale, once we start getting into positions which provide a salary, we are dealing mostly with skilled labor, which is either difficult to replace in the case of technicians, programmers, engineers, and so forth, or irreplaceable such as actors, craftsmen, or artists. Here, employees actually do have some bargaining power, since they are less likely to have the reserve army at their back, waiting to swoop in to accept a lower wage. However, in either case, the employee is always at a disadvantage in terms of power vis-a-vis the employer. He will not get to determine the type of work he will do.
Yes, he does. You actually have full power to determine the type of work he will do. Do you want to know how? I know that. Because in fact, right now, McDonald's would love it if I were to flip burgers for them. But I, in fact, do not want to do that. And guess what I have full and utter authority over saying, nah, don't want to do that. Complete authority to say that. What is this idea? Where does this come from? Where you think that you can't control the type of work you do? You can. You don't have to work for somebody if you don't want to. That is entirely within your control.
He will not get to determine the pace of the production, nor the terms of his benefits, hours, or commitments. Ultimately, his position is not too dissimilar from the unskilled proletariat, except that he is a relative aristocrat with regard to the compensation for his labor power, which according to the labor theory of value, is worth a multiple of that of an unskilled laborer.
Yeah, this guy's just a Marxist. Why didn't you say that in the beginning? He's just a Marxist. Right? You just say you're a Marxist. It's okay. You don't have to pretend that you're like a right-winger and say, well, I'm a national monarchist, and here are my arguments against libertarianism. Boom, labor theory of value. Boom, workers are exploited. Boom, boom, Marx says this. You don't have to pretend. It's okay, bro. You're allowed to just be open and honest. You can come out of the closet and say, yes, I am a Marxist. It'll feel a lot freer if you just be honest with people.
But what does it mean to say that such an imbalanced relationship is not meaningfully consensual? If you agree to imbalanced terms, isn't that agreement simply consent, and thus the terms of the contract are completely just, and the relationship...
I mean, tautologically, agreement is a synonym for consent to. Yes, just tautologically, agreement to terms is consent to those terms. That you're just saying the same thing twice there.
Relationship, therefore, entirely voluntary. This view of consent is entirely too simplistic and binary.
If only we had some sort of a principle, a non-aggression principle, where we could clarify exactly what we mean in precise praxeologic terms. Unfortunately, the NAP, it just means don't step on the snake guy. That's all it means, just don't step on the snake. what a ludicrous principle. These libertarians, what the hell are they talking about?
To say that one consents to something is to say that by an autonomous act, he has agreed to the...
An autonomous act. Let me just make sure I'm getting this right. So let's try and break this down. Pull up, okay, so autonomous, not controlled by others or outside forces, i.e. you chose that action. Okay. Every single action is an autonomous action, because it is in fact not possible. Let me just, I'm not fucking with you guys. I'm gonna go to the little definition here. That's what it says. This guy, he's got two big words for me, this guy. I have to Google these things. That's what it says. Every single action is in fact autonomous by this definition. No action that you're taking is in fact, it is coming from you, right? Where might this break down? If you are being physically controlled by another person, or perhaps some other sort of aggression. If only we had some kind of a principle where we could delineate between these things. If only we had some sort of a non-aggression principle so we could figure out when these autonomous actions are taking place.
In terms of that thing. But if consent originates in autonomy, wouldn't we have a problem if a person's individual autonomy were curtailed by a power imbalance?
Nope. Autonomy is not curtailed by a power imbalance. Justify that right this second. I know he's not going to. That's why I paused here. He's not going to justify that. Ever in this video will he justify how a power imbalance, namely, I'm richer than you, somehow means that you are no longer able to freely act. Never will he justify that. Because he doesn't want to justify that. Because he doesn't have a fucking principle. He doesn't have any actual solid, concrete principle here. So that's why he's going to pretend that we don't either. That's why he's got to pretend that the non-aggression principle just means, basically, don't step on the snake. He's got to pretend that, because that's about as deep as his legal knowledge goes on his front. Negative 38.89 for $2 US. Just shut it down, Natty. Yeah, this is pitiful.
Would consent that originates out of dysautonomy still be consent? No. If a person cannot determine all the parameters of his contract, he is not in any meaningful sense autonomous.
Cannot determine all of the parameters of his contract. So it's only free action if you are determining all of the parameters of your contract. So unless I can go to McDonald's and unilaterally declare, well, my payment will be 1 private jet per hour, and they have to accept that. Otherwise, I'm not free. That's what we're going for here, I guess. This is fucking pathetic.
With regard to the other employer and his relationship with him, the wage contract is fundamentally a relationship of subordination, and that subordination pre-exists the actual employment relationship by virtue of the fact that the capitalist holds the keys to economic power and the employee does not. If one wishes to engage with the economy and to get out of the market what the market exists for, presumably, which is the provision of human wants and needs.
You know how you do that in ancap? You can go piss off into the woods where nobody fucking cares to be, and you can try and make it on your own. I think you'll find you'd much rather take the deal with Domino's.
He must engage with the capitalist from a relationship of economic subordination. That pre-existent subordination renders the question of the employee's autonomy moot. He, in reality, does not actually have meaningful autonomy. The other question is whether one can legitimately surrender his natural rights via contract. I will once again bring up indentured servitude because in such a
No, that is the libertarian answer. No, you can't. There's no sense in which it's even sensible to speak about surrendering your natural rights by a contract. Contracts are the terms that define the transfer of title to property. Property rights are not rights over other rights. That doesn't make any goddamn sense. By the way, only 1 private jet per hour? Come now, Zulu, you can do better than that. Yeah, no, I want to be fair. I want to be fair to my employers.
Contract. One is giving up one's right to free movement and bodily autonomy for the sake of either a wage or the provision of his physical needs. Anarcho-capitalists would, according to the logic of voluntarist philosophy, conceive of such a relationship as voluntary slavery, which is...
See, this is the problem. When you have a video like this, this is the problem with videos like this, where they're claiming that they've got some manner of expertise, they've done the reading, they've looked into all the arguments, and yet they just swallow voluntary slavery as if it's just a fully accepted thing, and not a fringe belief held pretty much only by Walter Block, which, guess who gets actually mentioned in this video? Not Walter Block, Liquid Zulu gets mentioned in this video. Guess who has an entire section of his course dealing with the fact that voluntary slavery is a complete nonsense. Nothing. It has no place in our legal theory. This guy. This is just fucking pathetic.
In the final analysis, because the contract is fundamentally consensual, would not actually be slavery and thus would not violate self-ownership nor the NAP. However, if natural rights are a consequence of our ability to reason, and if we cannot surrender our ability to reason, we also cannot legitimately surrender our bodily autonomy.
State right now that that's already an accepted argument within anarcho-capitalism. That is a disputed fringe view within our theory that you can sell yourself into slavery. State that right now, or you are a massively dishonest person, Natty Bud Light.
Thus, there are some contracts which, even from within the boundaries of libertarian
Guess he's not gonna.
philosophy, which are impermissible even if they may be, in a rather simplistic and literal sense, consensual. It may seem like I'm just reading the phone book, because a lot of more intelligent ANCAPs will probably be nodding along or shouting, yes, that's what we argue.
There we go. It's this guy.
But hold on for a second. The capitalist workplace is not ran like a voluntarist organization where each employee is free to work and negotiate as he sees fit.
Yes, it is.
It is instead what Mark Fisher called capitalist Stalinism.
Well, gee whiz, if Mark Fisher calls it that, then what is this? I hate this fucking style of writing an essay where every, like, paragraph or two, they feel the need to fucking insert some quote to show that they've, like, done their reading to their fucking teacher who's going to be looking over this. There isn't going to be, you're not handing this into a lecturer, okay? You don't need to show, well, according to Mark Fisher, just make the arguments, bro. This is a YouTube video. Cut it out. Knock it off.
You produce based on quotas for bonuses. What you make and how you make it is essentially determined by CEOs, product leads, and managers.
And agreed upon by you. So you can, in fact, decide at any point, nah, I don't agree to that. If you guys want to keep me around, then you're going to have to abide by my terms or else I'm gone. You can do that at literally any second of your work under our theory in a capitalist workplace. You, in fact, can do that.
The rules you must follow in the workplace, the dress code, code of conduct, sexual harassment.
Okay, so if I'm to get this guy right, if we want to have a truly free workplace to get away from this capitalism, every individual must be able to decide on their own dress code, on their own sexual harassment policies, what work they're going to be doing, when they'll be doing it, and what they're going to be compensated. Gee whiz, if oppression means getting rid of somebody's ability to sexually harass at will, then lock me up and throw away the fucking key, because I'm an oppressive capitalist.
Policies, DEI policies, and discrimination policies, and so on, are essentially mandated. Everything takes place in a rigid hierarchy of power, authority, and command. What is in fact happening is that the employee is contracting to give up his right to act, reason, and speak freely for the sake of earning a wage through producing for the company. Other than the fact that outside of special circumstances, you can choose to quit your job if you disagree with its policies, the wage contract is virtually identical.
Outside of special circumstances, our claim is you can always just quit. That's what makes it voluntary. You can just quit. You don't have to stay there. You cannot sell yourself away.
To indentured servitude, in terms of its requirement that you surrender your intellectual and bodily autonomy to
No, you don't surrender anything. You're working in tandem. You're working in tandem with the company.
An employer. I won't even get to the aforementioned special circumstances such as specified period, non-compete clauses, and other such things which materially restrict your economic autonomy.
Yeah, so we're against any quote-unquote contracts that are not based in pure title transfer theory. So there is no such a thing as a non-compete clause or a contracted period or anything like that. No such thing in our theory.
It should be obvious enough how voluntary...
And this is just so fucking rich. Why are we hearing all this bullshit? Coming from a monarchist. You want all these things dialed up to 11 just with the monarch in charge. Like, why are we hearing this thing from a fucking monarchist? It doesn't make any goddamn sense.
Such things are. Now let's get on to the question of whether capitalism is compatible with liberty. Obviously, libertarians claim that their philosophy is based upon the principle of liberty, which in their view simply means negative liberty or freedom from coercion. We can obviously...
Oh, again with the fucking sloppiness. Sloppiness at every goddamn fucking turn.
question this premise that liberty ought to be defined in purely negative terms, which I will not get into here. I've discussed this problem in other.
So you're being sloppy, and then you're also not explaining your sloppy formulation fully. Brilliant.
Videos, and this one is long enough as it is. So let's suppose that we accept that liberty means freedom from coercion. Is the system represented by voluntarist capitalism compatible with freedom from coercion? To begin to survey this question, it's helpful to consider what actually counts as coercion.
This is the problem with using these fucking super imprecise principles, because libertarianism is not about freedom from coercion. Because immediately he can then go into, well, coercion just means force, and they're fine with force sometimes, so I guess these guys are in contradiction. That's the problem with having these fucking retarded foundations from a guy who's supposed to have fucking expertise in this, mind you. That's what he fucking said. No. What we stand for is the non-aggression principle. Aggression is the initiation of conflicts. Conflicts are mutually exclusive action. That is what we stand for. That's it. That's all. Okay, so stop trying to homebrew your own goddamn half-bastard form of libertarian principles on the fly. You're not good enough to do that.
Coercion is the non-consensual use of force to compel a person to act or compel them to refrain from acting. I've already concluded that the wage contracts under capitalism are not entirely consensual and instead sit somewhere.
Kinsella literally addressed the use of these metaphors and vague terms. Yeah, exactly. Like that's. Let me pull up that Kinsella article. Yeah, the problem with coercion. This bad boy. This is why we don't use coercion as any sort of a pillar term in our theory. It is riddled with issues if you try to do that. I would definitely recommend people check it out. As you can see, not a very long article. Bit of a stub here. It's really like, this is so dishonest coming from Natty Bud Light.
Toward the slavery end of this.
And by the way, this is not even just like, it might be one thing if he was just asked out of nowhere, like on a live stream or something, hey, what is your opinion on libertarianism? And he like kind of rattled some of these off the top of his head, and he's like, I'm not really too familiar with it, but that would be one thing. It's the fact that he is presenting himself as a knowledgeable figure on libertarian philosophy, that he did all the reading, he was a libertarian for years, and he's presenting it in this way. It is totally just strawmanning libertarianism for his, I don't know, Marxist or monarchist audience. It's so dishonest. Null paradigm for 10 Canadian dollars, thank you very much. Might need time, but if you could pick one, what do you think is the strongest argument against anarcho-capitalism or the NAP you've heard? Where does it still fail? Strongest argument against it, let me think. Probably the emergencies case. Like, hey, we're in like this dire emergency right now where you've got to commit an aggression in order to keep living, to keep surviving. And life is the standard of value, so what the heck? This thing clearly has limits. The emergency provision, the like lifeboat scenario, is probably the strongest argument. If you want to know my full take on that, in my video, Anarcho-Capitalism Responding to the Critics, I have a dedicated section on that type of argument. In short, I believe it is a form of reification of the zero. That is treating a nothing as a something. That is the problem with survivalism in general. It treats the standard of ethics to be the avoidance of death, that is the avoidance of a nothing, rather than the attainment of a positive. That is the problem with it.
Spectrum without fully reaching it, since it entails the pre-existing economic subordination of the employee to the capitalist, as well as the fact that the company reserves the right to use force after the employee has signed on. Since such relationships are not